So we wanted to use these data to better understand environmental and sociodemographic factors that are associated with asthma exacerbation risk. To do this, we identified all patients with an asthma exacerbation, at least one asthma exacerbation between July of 2016 and September of 2023. And we have over 11,000 exacerbations among adults, over 20,000 among children. Looking at some characteristics of patients coming in for asthma exacerbation, we see, even though about 30% of the overall asthma PIMCO cohort is Black, over 60% of patients in this subpopulation, this asthma exacerbation subpopulation, are Black. Yeah, so I'll just pull that one thing out.
Tell us the difference between an asthma patient and asthma exacerbation.
So the asthma patients in the overall cohort, they either have a diagnosis of asthma or symptoms related to asthma, like cough or wheeze. So it's catching more people. And then the asthma exacerbation cohort, our criteria for an asthma exacerbation would be an ED visit or higher, so including inpatient with a diagnosis of asthma. So it's a smaller group of people. They've received that particular.
So the people show up in emergency.
Yeah, emergency room. Yeah. Looking at the distribution of asthma exacerbation, like where patients are coming from, we see that most adults are coming from Maryland, and kids are coming from a mix of Maryland and Florida. So 85% of the asthma exacerbation encounters are among patients who live in Maryland. About 2/3 in children are among patients who live in Maryland, and then the remaining third, 27 and 7% here, are coming from Florida. Most of those coming from Pinellas County, where All Children's Hospital is. These maps are similar to those before, except now we're just looking at that subpopulation of individuals who have a history of asthma exacerbation. But we see similar patterns where East Baltimore has a higher concentration of patients, and it's really centered around the hospital. So we have adults, kids. And similarly for Florida. Moving from the spatial to linking this with environmental, we use the patient's census tract and the day of their exacerbation to link to the environmental variables I mentioned. So maximum temperature, minimum temperature, and DTR. Here I have an example with the maximum temperature. There's a lot going on in this plot, so we'll do like one thing at a time and start with the top panel. So the black curve that's going up and down, that's the daily exacerbation count among children in Baltimore City. That's in the back. On top of it is a red curve, which is just a smooth predicted curve, trying to smooth out some of the noise and the day-to-day variation in exacerbations. Behind it, you see these vertical strips with the color. So that red, a bright red one, corresponds to a really hot day. The darkest blue corresponds to the coldest day. And those are coming from the Tmax or the maximum daily temperature that we've linked to the person's census tract and date of exacerbation. So you can see the seasonal effects as we move from the warmer summer months to the cooler winter months. And there are peaks in the spring and fall. So as we move from the blue to the red, as it goes from the cooler winter months to the warmer summer months, we have a peak, and that corresponds with allergens are high. And then again in the fall, we're moving, kids are going back to school. The other panels are Baltimore County and Pinellas County, interpreted the same way. We also link to area deprivation index, where a higher ADI corresponds to greater neighborhood poverty and lower would be less neighborhood poverty. And we have our exacerbation map that we looked at together. Oops. And we hypothesized that greater neighborhood poverty would be associated with an increased risk of asthma exacerbation. The models supports that. So we see that as ADI increases, so along the x-axis there, we move from lower ADI or lower neighborhood poverty to higher. The predicted number of asthma exacerbations is also increasing. The two curves correspond to Maryland and Florida, Maryland in blue, Florida in red. So we see that the relationship is more pronounced in Maryland than Florida, as evidenced by just the steeper slope on that curve. We stratified by whether it was a low, medium, or high DTR day. So we split it into thirds for DTR to see, is this relationship between asthma exacerbation risk and ADI the same if it's a day with low temperature variability or a day with high temperature variability. So on the left, we have low temperature variability. On the right, we have high temperature variability. We see the relationship in Maryland remains the same. In Florida, there's just a shift in the curve where the overall predicted number of exacerbations increases. So in summary, we have an asthma cohort with over 500,000 patients. And we're interested in learning about asthma exacerbations, where we have over 30,000 events among nearly 20,000 patients. We see clear seasonal trends with peaks in the spring and fall for children, and a strong relationship between ADI and asthma exacerbations that's more pronounced in Maryland, and an overall elevated risk on days with greater temperature variability in Florida only. And moving forward, we hope to incorporate additional environmental exposures and patient level characteristics, including air pollution, allergens, humidity, medication use, BMI, and obesity. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, really well presentation. Very interesting. Question. This is more of a general question. I think it applies more broadly. Can you go to slide 26, I think? So my understanding is this is only people who are using the medical system. So I have just a general comment of concern. It looks like there's no asthma in West Baltimore. And so if these figures are presented outside of an academic audience, I could see people being concerned about living in East Baltimore versus West Baltimore, but it's just a different hospital system. Exactly.
Yeah, so those patients may be receiving care at University of Maryland instead of Johns Hopkins. And I see, yeah.
Like, people that use that from West Baltimore, it would normalize, like, we have 100 people in West Baltimore that use it. So we divide like number of cases we get by the number of people in the system. I'm very conscious about sharing data with community groups, and I feel like something like this would be more reasonable. That's an output.
I guess I'm wondering, it sounds like the one question relates to generalizability. And so whether or not sort of the findings in East Baltimore would generalize to West Baltimore. I think when we're looking at the exacerbations, we're looking at this sort of case only design where you're looking at all people who had exacerbations, and then you're looking at the conditions that preceded them among a cohort of exacerbators. A lot of the potential internal biases are mitigated by the approach, but then the generalizability framework, and then, you know, the fact that our sample is represented only by a portion of Baltimore. I think that is a limitation that is unique to this cohort because it's in the healthcare system. One thing we hope to do is, at a next step, would be to get data from the health department using CRISP and other data sources. So we could think about this as sort of the demonstration project, get the model designs, think about refining the question and the approach, and then extending it to applying a similar approach with other data sources. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I think that's.
I mean, I think this is just a more broad question because we show spatial data across many different environmental factors, health data, things like that. And how we display that data and how we can understand that. I'm not trained in this, it's all new to me. But how we can explain that academically is very different than how we perceive that. Because NESEC is meant to translate and take our results and make them more community facing and integrate them. I want to make sure that the work that we're doing we don't get sidetracked by people saying, well, there's no asthma in like Baltimore, I just saw on that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could, you have like that total counts of patients, right?
Yeah.
Like, we should think about like,
Yeah.
graying out parts of the city
Yeah.
that like, we just don't have enough counts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for messaging, we might want to go back to that, the data from the health department to describe the problem, and then say we took a deep dive among a cohort at getting their care here, and then maybe not show the map, maybe that's a descriptor, but not the visual.
And I'm happy to work with you. This is what I do.
Awesome, great, thank you, Emily.
I really enjoy,
Oh, this is great. I think it's an important part to talk through and get other perspectives in the room. I think our next up is going to be Damon Madrigano, who I believe is joining us from Zoom.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I think that was actually a good segue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using administrative health data. I think Emily and Bianca did a great job talking about the fantastic work they've been doing using the asthma pin code, which has a lot of really excellent features, as Meredith mentioned, but it isn't complete coverage of Baltimore City, and that is why we are hoping to get administrative data. We've been working to get that through the city health department, but are now have been facing some challenges, so are taking a different route and requesting that from the state of Maryland. So I just wanted to talk a little bit. This is really all about planned analyses and maybe can just give some perspective. There are limitations to this data, of course, but will be more complete coverage of the city, and so what we hope to do when we can get this data. We've talked a lot about asthma, certainly a really primary concern in the city of Baltimore. But more broadly, we heard some presentations earlier this morning. Elliot had a really nice talk about heat-related mortality. How can urban greening impact that? So we want to look broadly at all-cause mortality as well as some specific causes of mortality. We want to look at that citywide, and we want to be able to use that information for some of our decision tools like City Eat, for example. And so that's what we're hoping to get out of some planned analysis using administrative health data. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, the title got a little shifted. So there are tons of studies on heat and mortality. Again, Elliot referenced a few this morning. So studies have been conducted in Europe, across the US, nationally, in different cities. This graphic is showing you a study that looked at 10 large cities within the US. And showing the relationship between daily temperature and that relative risk of all-cause mortality. And what I wanted to just show from this slide is that relationship really differs from place to place. The shape of the curve looks different. And that's why it's really important. I mean, we could take estimates from the literature. Certainly, there's a lot of literature out there on this topic, but it's really important for us to derive that relationship ourselves for using Baltimore-specific data. The reasons why Baltimore might be different than other places. I mean, certainly climatology has something to do with it, what people are acclimatized to, but the population within Baltimore is unique as well. So we want to think about demographics. Baltimore is a majority Black or African American city. And we know from the literature that this population is much more susceptible to heat because of a long-standing structural racism that has led to both higher exposure and more limited capacity. If we think about potentially limited access to healthcare, poor housing conditions in some cases. So there's a whole host of things that we know may make this population much more susceptible to die during an extreme heat event or a heat wave event. And so we want to tailor our estimates, factoring the population demographics into account, and get some city-specific, Baltimore-specific numbers. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oops, is there a slide before that?
Did we not have your right presentation?
Yeah, it looks like something got a little messed up. That's okay. Okay, so I'll just talk about a couple of things that I wanted to mention before coming to this slide, which is that there are a few things, how we do this, how we estimate the exposure response relationship. That is done by taking, again, specific temperature data, specific Baltimore temperature data, or exposure data, which there's, a lot of great presentations already today about estimating that and looking at that over different periods of time, and specific health data from Baltimore. So what we hope to get is vital records data, a series of mortality data over a long period of time, and also citywide and statewide hospitalization data. I wanted to point out a couple of things. One thing is that when we do this kind of estimation, we use historical data. Okay, so we're not just looking for this year's worth of data. We're looking for several years historically, so that we can estimate that relationship between historical temperatures and health outcomes like death or hospitalization that have already occurred. We also need a lot of data. Elliot mentioned some imprecision in the estimates, and the way we kind of close in on that and get those estimates more precise is by having more data. So we'll hopefully be getting at least 10 years of mortality data and at least 10 years of hospitalization data to make this work. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we estimate these kinds of relationships, Bianca talked about the two types of study designs that are typically used, time series and case crossover. Those make use of temporal comparisons. So day-to-day changes in temperature and day-to-day changes in mortality or hospitalization. And we like these study designs because they eliminate a lot of things that can bias our studies, that are different between people. So we don't want to get to a spurious association because two people are compared to each other and they have different socioeconomics. So we make these comparisons over the day. We compare people to themselves, or we compare populations to themselves. And that really helps with the estimation of that health exposure health relationship in terms of making it more valid. But what we really need is that very granular temporal variability. So we need temperature every day, or if we wanted to look even at overnight temperatures, for example, we might even want hourly temperature. We also like to have spatial granularity. That will help us to tease out neighborhood effects. But I do want to mention that unlike the precision medicine data, this administrative data at best will probably get at census tract. So the health data will probably be limited to census tract, and that will be as fine as we can kind of make those exposure response relationships. And then just to show you what that could look like, this is some previous work that I've done quite a while ago in New York City, where we did that same thing. We looked at the relationship between extreme heat and mortality overall citywide, and then also looked at different census tracts on how that variability differed by census tract based on characteristics that were within our data that we could kind of disentangle from the mortality record. And what you can see on this map is once we plotted out, we developed an index using that epidemiologic work. And once we plotted that out, we could see particular neighborhoods that were highly heat vulnerable, those neighborhoods identified in red. Those are neighborhoods that are sort of designated as the highest quintile of this heat vulnerability index. And the graph on the left is showing you that those neighborhoods have the highest risk of people dying. People who lived in those neighborhoods had the highest risk of dying during a heat wave. Okay, next slide. So in terms of, I mentioned that we were working with Baltimore City Health Department to try and get this data. I don't think it was a complete lost cause because we have a relationship with them now. We know that they're interested in this work. So hopefully that'll, when we do get the data and are able to work on the analysis, and hopefully it'll make it more useful for them. But we are going through or starting the process to go to request the data through the state of Maryland. And of course, there will be IRBs associated with that, which will take some time. But we can then hopefully be looking at the relationship with Baltimore specific data of temperature and all-cause mortality, mortality from specific causes, and then hospitalizations from specific causes. And I've listed a few here, but I want to now turn it over to Kristen to talk more specifically about maternal and child health, which is something she is very interested in sort of using this data to tease out.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm a couple slides down. You can just keep going. Next slide, please. So I can introduce myself. I'm Kristen Schneider. I'm at Penn State. I'm an assistant professor in public health. And I'm quite interested in how the environment can impact people during a time of pregnancy and postpartum. So this is just some background, recent, this is a review paper talking about how climate change can impact pregnancy outcomes. And these are some pregnancy outcomes that have been really investigated in the literature in terms of complications. Birth weight is the one that's often looked at. Restricted fetal growth, preterm birth, spontaneous abortion, which is miscarriage, and neonatal mortality. Other studies too, more recently, have been looking at maternal morbidity, severe maternal morbidity. And that I think would be really interesting for us to look into as well, which is a classification of ICD-10 codes determined by the CDC to result in severe maternal morbidity, which could be things that we call near misses, or times when somebody is really sick during their pregnancy and could result in mortality if they did not have proper access to healthcare. So as you can see, there's just one more thing I was going to say. Basically, there's these indirect ways that it could impact pregnancy and maternal health, and then direct. So that's it. You can go to the next slide. Sorry. I just wanted to mention too, just specifically looking at Maryland. I found this study. This is only looking at maternal mortality. It's not looking at environmental causes, but just to see that this is the difference in outcomes by white and Black people. So this is incredibly serious and very, very important in the area of maternal health, especially now, but it always has been, these different health disparities by race. And I think this is impacted by climate, and it's something we'd like to look at in our research. Okay, next slide, thanks. So these are a couple planned research questions that we're thinking about at this time. We're interested in heat, but I think also rainfall needs to just be different. These will just be different analyses, but both of these we found previously could be associated with poor health in general, different things that we've done. So they looked at different outcomes. But in the case for this project, I think we want to look at, are these environmental effects independently associated with asthma exacerbations in adults, and is the association modified by pregnancy status? So we want to know, so we know that we've already heard a lot today about how these can be associated or are associated with asthma, but I'm specifically wondering about, okay, well, what about if someone's pregnant, are they even more likely? Is pregnancy making it even more likely that they're going to have an asthma exacerbation during this time? So that's something I think we're planning to look at. And then also we want to look at areas. I didn't include a Baltimore map, although I should have, but we've seen them. And we want to look at areas within Baltimore that could be at higher risk, or demographic groups that may be more vulnerable. And then secondly, we're interested in just among, so the first question is looking at pregnancy as its own risk factor. So comparing pregnant and non-pregnant people, and specifically women of reproductive ages. And then for the second one, we'd be interested in just looking at pregnant people. Is heat or rainfall associated with the incidence of severe maternal morbidity, which I've already mentioned, preterm birth or low birth weight? And other studies have looked at this, but I think specifically we want to look at these kind of mitigating factors that Jimmy was talking about too. So what kind of environment, either neighborhood, what kind of neighborhood could be mitigating this, if it's green space or otherwise? And then what kind of demographic groups are more vulnerable? Are there socioeconomic variables that should be considered, and so forth? So right now, these are also planned analyses. We are interested in getting electronic medical records. So we're under the IRB process and have been, but I do think we're making progress there, and we should hopefully we will get approval soon to get access to EMR data. Environmental data and area deprivation index, we have access to. And And then also there's data that we're exploring. So I'm working with Jamie on the hospitalization data. So we'd be interested in potentially using that and even maybe looking at birth certificate data in Maryland. So we're under those discussions as well. And so these are the next steps. We have a PhD student who's starting in July, end of July, and then finishing the IRB process. I think we're really close, but coming up, and then obtaining our data. So thanks all.
Thank you, Kristen. That's it. Does anybody have any questions or? Sounds like we're ready to go to the next one.
Your time.
Is that
Sure.
into the session? Is that?
Yeah, so that's the end of the health session.
You're on the schedule to stop next.
Oh, well, that was, I was gonna say, I kept getting the, like, go. So really, we wanted to just, open it up for discussion, if any, I think you've had a broad overview of, sort of the work that we're planning, the work that's been started. A lot of the foundational work, basically aggregating these data, pulling in environmental data, merging it to health data, and some of the administrative parts of assembling the team and the regulatory processes have taken a lot of time, as you can imagine. But we're pretty excited about where we are now and our ability to answer the questions we put forth, as well as other ancillary questions. And so we mentioned asthma quite a lot today, and we know that that's an issue that means a lot to the community, but I think this is also another area where we can have bi-directional conversation with our community partners to try to understand what would be of highest priority for us to be putting on this list. Go ahead.
So my question's more about data and like, so I'm learning so much today, I just have to say.
Oh, good.
And in the beginning, like talking about how there's so much more data gathering going on in places where we haven't had the data or where the models tend to extrapolate or failing to show how hot it is that kind of better data that was being talked about this morning going to be incorporated into what you're doing?
I think that's a good question. I think yes is the short answer, and I would say Kirsten would be a good person to comment on that as well as others.
We've incorporated a lot of data sets so far, kind of the nationally available data. But the search network we're talking about more tomorrow morning, high resolution air pollution monitoring network, we want to incorporate that data for PM and potentially other groups as well. High resolution temperature data and others like thinking about. I think a lot of this have questions related to neighborhood characteristics that actually be a part of that.
And I think Bianca's work is an example of where we're looking to see where higher resolution data may be more meaningful and may be sort of required or give us additional benefit, or maybe where lower resolution data that's available across the country or more broadly may also work well, and sort of what are the trade-offs, what are the differences. And so hopefully those types of projects that are, I put them in this sort of methodology category, might help refine our use of
It's
this.
still on. I'm just gonna mention, like, there was a question about like kind of the the overlapping error bars with zero and stuff, but I still think showing out to 2 weeks, there's very few things that we expect to have that long of a lag time. So we kind of focused in on that first, say, 4 days or something. But you see that effect was just barely overlapping the null. I think it's still very interesting considering the sample size and the balance that exists there. So
And that was
it's
the
very-
first
very
pass
interesting
without
program.
a lot of refinement for confounders and other things that we
So,
have available to us.
I think it's very promising.
Question on.
Oh, great. Can you read it?
Yeah, so it's from Abram. Victoria asks, can you speak on strategies for working with Baltimore City Health Department versus Maryland Department of Environment? For data, you mentioned including them in the IRB process. Can you expand on that comment?
I can also let Jamie comment if she would like to, but we are interested in expanding our data capture to be more representative of Baltimore City and the state of Maryland. And so we're really looking to try to understand the most efficient way of working with those governmental partners and governmental agencies from an IRB standpoint, I think we've probably navigated the most logistically challenging from a Hopkins IRB, because the electronic health data has the most highly identifiable data. And so it's really a matter of sort of understanding the regulatory process from the external agencies. Anyone else would love feedback, but. And anyone.
Yeah, I can.
As those agencies who wants to sort of partner with us, we are highly interested. Go ahead, Jane.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that, yeah, so we had first explored a partnership with Baltimore City Health Department, who does, of course, have data on deaths and of residents within the city of Baltimore. And actually, one of our trainees at the School of Public Health was already working with some of that data. So we thought that would be a more efficient path to getting the data, but we ran into some challenges. So through state health departments, there is always a process for requesting and obtaining that data, whether that's vital statistics to give mortality or birth data, or hospital discharge data, which in many cases, including with the state of Maryland, there is a fee associated with that. So that's another thing we kind of need to evaluate, sort of how worth it that piece of the data will be, in terms of how much it will cost. But and the process just involves figuring out the right people to talk to, which we were able to do, and understanding what their data request procedures are. And so there's a data request procedure, and then a state of Maryland IRB process that we need to get approved through, and then of course the Hopkins or Penn State, all the institutional IRBs as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but sometimes there just can be some time that it takes to get these data. And I think we got like a little further delayed because we were exploring one path and now are exploring a different path in terms of getting the data.
Oh, yeah, so I'm learning a lot of new things here, and just some random thoughts as someone working on atmospheric dynamics is that I think there's most frequent asthma number by in spring and fall, and I think that's very interesting. So my first question is like how general it is. Is that only here, or is it national wide, or is it like global wide? And the second is that it makes me thinking about something unique, maybe in the weather pattern in spring and fall. That is not an absolute temperature value. That's is kind of the fluctuation from week to week. For example, 1 week 90, next week 30, something like that.
Yeah. I think you bring up a few good points. We know there are those seasonal trends nationally across the board. They relate largely to what's known to allergens like pollen, for example, as well as viruses, which we know for kids, especially in the fall when they go back to school. So we're working on trying to understand those and then tease out the independent effects of other factors like pollution and temperature, for example. We do think that pollen, the seasonality of pollen in the context of climate, that's a really big question that many have identified as a priority, and we will have the ability to look at that downstream. So I think those are great points. And those are the types of effects that I think Emily's working on teasing out.
Bells were.
Oh, and yeah, Melissa Pavlak, who's also one of our trainees, has really been digging into that as well. There's another question.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
kind of all, sorry, not still here. Thanks, yeah. So now we have the transport theme, the theme of one person. Or two, so I'm going to try and find my way around here. Oh, that's what's happened. We're in a slide. Yeah, no, it's not. Oh, there it goes. Did you upload it?
Yeah, like little, so.
No, I haven't downloaded, so. No, we're in the afternoon, is it?
It is.
Do you see it here?
So, yeah, second from the.
Oh, there.
Yes, sorry. Okay.
I didn't download it, so hopefully it will be okay if it works in Google Slide.
Yeah. So, so
Okay.
I'll start, just for sake of time.
You start and I'll download it, that'll be.
Yeah, thanks. So transportation is a pulling along. It's myself and two others from Penn State who make up the transportation theme. So today I'm just gonna kind of give an overview of the work that we're interested in doing, some of the types of questions that we ask as transportation engineers, and kind of where we see how we can kind of plug into BSEC and the network. So,
Are we sharing?
yes, this is great.
Oh, no, I'm not sharing.
You're not sharing.
How do I do that?
So yeah, so there's three of us, in that, and I'm gonna kind of organize the presentation, first talking about, of course, transportation as a source of air pollutants, but then, kind of much of the work that a lot of us are interested in are mitigation strategies, and other aspects of transportation. So yeah, so these are the group, and you can see some of our research areas. So none of us would consider ourselves as like climate scientists, just to put that out there, but I think a lot of the work that we do would plug in nicely to BSEC and some of the work that is happening here, doing work with like electric vehicles, bike ped related transportation, how to shift people to cleaner modes, looking at like policy interventions and levers, so kind of more on the solution side as well. We also do a lot with transportation modeling, so we could look at like future scenarios and what the transportation network would look like under different scenarios as well. So as I said before, I'm gonna organize it in three quick parts. First one, of course, transportation as a source of negative impacts to the environment, which everybody in this room is very aware of. And then, of course, given it's a source, how do we mitigate transportation's impact to the environment, which is something that a lot of us do work in. And then thinking about how transportation is impacted, particularly from a resiliency and a public health standpoint. Okay, so this one is more of a plea for let us know how we can help. So some things that we do from the transportation side of things is we can both estimate as well as collect data on traffic volume, modal mixes. We do a lot of modeling between transportation and land use connections. So thinking about, if something changes in the city and now we have a lot of, development downtown and infill, what would that look like for transportation miles and that sort of thing. Looking at planning. And then, of course, we can do some like EPA models with like Maxim and MOVES and whatnot. So we've talked about some projects that we're interested in doing. So I'm kind of like laying them out here. So one thing, of course, with the Key Bridge closure, my department got very, very busy with a lot of inquiries about what's the impact on the transportation network. So we do have some interest in looking at like the diversions of traffic, particularly through the neighborhoods and what that impact could be. We do a lot of work in like pedestrian and bicycle transportation as well. So thinking about like life cycle assessment of the green modes and are they actually green? So for example, like bike and scooter shares seem good on the surface, but then when you think about where people are coming from and going to, oftentimes you have to reposition all those vehicles, and that's usually done in a vehicle. So you're kind of counteracting the good that's happening. So looking at some of those like total picture views of even some of the green modes of transportation as well.
So on the minimizing the impact side, so a lot that we do is in travel behavior and trying to predict people's unpredictability when it comes to how they travel and how they make decisions. So from a travel behavioral standpoint, we can do things through observations. We can also do things through surveying and looking at different scenarios for people. So some work that we've been talking about is just what are people's appetite to greener modes of transportation? Is it something that we're hearing is a consideration? So even just in the conversations we've had through VSET, interestingly, most of our conversations with community groups have centered on safety, which is what we hear first as transportation folks. And so we've thought a lot about how do we kind of address what the community wants, but still trying to honor what VSEC is about, and how to create projects that are both addressing community wants and needs, but also still has that environmental link. Is something that has been a little tricky for us, because really safety tends to be like the first thing we hear, but there's some links, right? Like slowing traffic, moving traffic can have some environmental implications. So there are some creative ways of linking those together. We're really interested in how to shift people to different modes of transportation. On my side, I'm very interested in shifting through design as opposed to maybe shifting through pricing or things that are a little less equitable. So we've talked a lot about creating equitable incentives, like carrot versus a stick, where a carrot would be like a rebate program or something positive that you give to encourage a shift, as opposed to a stick, like pricing and things that tend to price out lower income, allowing, like the luxury tolling, for example, is a scenario like that. So thinking about how we can encourage people to lower their footprint. A lot of transportation really centers on community engagement, so that's probably a place that we can also lend a hand. In every transportation project, we are mandated to engage with the community, so we do have experience with a lot of community engagement work, also with surveying, as well as I said, I think a little bit earlier, and then linking it to policy analysis and on the solution side. So I have been working with Mike on getting some transportation questions in the Baltimore area survey, so be excited to see those results. And from a modeling standpoint, there are some interesting things with like signal timings and like smart signals that we can do. So you can try to reduce, idling and those sort of impacts with smart signal timing. Been having some initial conversation with with some of the projects that are happening out in West Baltimore to see if they're doing anything with the signals. I think they're upgrading some of the controllers now, so we may be able to test some smart signal strategies in the future as well. And then the third part is the environmental challenges piece. So this is really looking at resiliency in our road network. One area, of course, is flooding, right? So we can look at where flooding is likely, look at traffic volumes, look at the importance of critical roadway networks to see kind of where are those most vulnerable areas in the road network. And then from the health standpoint, just looking at exposure of various modes, like exposure while cycling, exposure while waiting at a bus stop, while walking, as well as heat impacts too, is very important in transportation. So I know from a modeling standpoint, typically people are just interested in, the amount of emissions being generated at a location. But from a transportation standpoint, we're really interested into from where are they coming from and where are they going? And that really gets at equity issues, because oftentimes those who are bearing the impacts of transportation emissions tend to have the lowest footprint, and those who are generating, right, are not necessarily those being exposed, right? So you're thinking about, you're looking at downtown Baltimore, where are people coming from? Are they coming from the county into the city? So just kind of looking at that dichotomy between who is polluting and who is bearing those burdens is something that we've talked about. You can do things like license plate studies and stuff to see like where people are coming from. So yeah, so sample projects. So initially we talked about cyclist exposure, but cyclists actually don't have too bad of exposure because they're in open air. But there is some work on how you design like the cycle track, like if it's buffered as opposed to being right up against traffic, you have lower things as well. And so just to wrap up, where we're trying to go, we want to do something with bus stops. We've had some listening conversations with MTA, who's interested in heat. Of course, we heard a lot about trees and greening from the initial BSEC stakeholder meetings. And then I've been talking with No Boundary Coalition, who does listening sessions with their community in West Baltimore, and they're really interested in getting more shelters and stuff. And so what I am thinking about doing is leveraging this Amtrak corridor, which does not necessarily link offhand, but the reason why we're interested in stops along the Amtrak corridor is there's a grant opportunity with the new construction of Amtrak where they're doing community impact. So we can actually look at doing some before and after studies and get a grant to actually implement some changes at the bus stops around that corridor, which does fall in the region of No Boundaries, who I've been chatting with. So thinking about doing a study on heat exposure as well as along bus stops along the Amtrak corridor and going after a supplemental grant to actually do some before and after analysis. Because one, the other two people in transportation need money to do some work. So that's one avenue we're hoping to pursue. And I saw the time up sign. So if you're interested in working with us, let me know, email, or you can scan the QR code and fill out a quick form. That's answer the question.
Question for you and the colleagues.
Oh, no.
I saw on one of your earlier slides a bullet about modeling transportation and land use connections, and I'm just curious about that. I'm from the Forest Service, so I'm interested in green space as a land use, or in tree planting and things like that. I was wondering if that fits into what you're thinking.
Yeah, so I mean, what we often do will like estimate like the amount of trips that will be generated depending on how the land is being used. So like if it's a park area, we can generate how many trips we expect and when it will be, which would be a different time of day than like a place that has a job center, for example.
Safety,
Yes.
very interesting. So a couple questions with safety. Are the people in the city more concerned about safety than in the rural areas? Are the less wealthy people more concerned about safety than the? So what's the distribution of concern about safety then? And then are there potential synergies between safety improvements that people want and environmental improvements, which they might do if they was the same?
Yeah, I'll start with the latter, yes. I think one example is with speeds. There's like a sweet spot in terms of safety, where we lower speeds, you're less likely to have fatalities.
Charles Street.
Exactly.
No one's going very.
And there's environmental benefits to that, too. In terms of differences in rural, urban areas, I think there's different safety concerns depending on where you are. So for example, in rural areas, safety concerns may be like, going off of the road, for example, at night. Or, speeding or at intersections, where in urban areas, there's a lot focused on pedestrians' ability to cross safely and that interaction between heads and vehicles.
But everyone was concerned about safety.
Yeah, I mean, I've been mostly talking in Baltimore City, so I don't really have a pulse on the outskirts in the area, but in the city, it's slowing traffic and pedestrians. Okay. I'll be here for coffee.
Yeah, you're follow backer. This is really interesting. I think a number of us have been thinking about the air quality implications of the bridge collapse and wondering if you have data sources that we aren't aware of, or the things that I was also, I guess, wondering about that related to the timing of the traffic lights too, which to me seems like a safety issue, because I think this 800 lights in a row, you might be less likely to run that red. Just wondering, like, if your what data sources you are using.
Yeah, so we have vehicle counts, so there's different roadway sensors, we can see how traffic has diverted. I don't know so much from like air quality standpoint, but I can at least tell, you know, like maybe these are the areas that we should do extra monitoring at baseline. For, depends on the road. Yeah, it depends on the road. For like highways and stuff, yes. For local roads, it's a little bit different. It's also tricky because the bridge is right on the edge of the city and the county. In the city, they control all their streets. In the county, it's a mix between local and state roads.
Okay, we'll break for a coffee now and back at 3:15. Go on. Yeah.
No, it's okay.
This one? So you're Selena? So have we met?
No, I don't.
Okay, so I'm just, oh, I didn't want to do that.
I uploaded mine.
Okay, I'm gonna put Selena first before. I can- so- No. You're,
I'm technically, you know, me, but I'm working with the horse.
okay.
Mine should be right at the top, I think.
No problem.
You probably have some.
Oh, there, I didn't even. Okay, that's good. I wanna
Thank you.
Remember, yeah, so. Before I do anything. Yep.
All right, thank you.
Good presentation. Hope we can find a way to get it to be.
We're gonna need what? I have a student now.
No, get away.
We can talk about this. Year training.
I think so. I don't know how much.
They had time, like, they're very interested. I'm like, here, take our students. Let's do something. I'm not so
When are we back? We're back at
3:15.
3:15, okay, great. Yep.
You just don't do it. Okay, but what are the, how do you have it? We should talk about it later. So I've got two pathways. So find out.
So Krishna asked, when you separate the energy burden between the places, it looked like West Baltimore was identified as high burden. West Baltimore, East Baltimore. And so if you look at what went into it, is it because the housing is different? Or if you look at any of the social, economic indicators, they're very similar. So I was just very curious to know, the housing stock, that's different.
I would say my father that he's about since it's not close to the harbor, that's why it's not much of a
Yeah, but it's a bit.
It is, but it shows up if you get, okay. Okay, yeah, you should do it. Yes, can you say these are preliminary results? No, baby. No, it's no problem. No, it's just. I said you would have this.
And if you wanna like. Sometimes that.
So what I said.
So this area here
Yeah.
is, if you look at the town, it's very low. I'm curious to know what the aspect is. Can you pull apart the energy burden and say, okay, not now, but you know, okay, it's because this place has smaller houses or has.
So it's kind of similar. I didn't look at the areas with energy burden right now.
Right, okay.
But I would say like maybe the income is higher, maybe the architecture is higher.
It's not.
Right.
So this area in here, this is the forest part. Yeah, so there's an area in here that is.
Yes.
Well, certainly as forest out there. So. Okay, that's interesting, because to me,
Yeah.
I don't, I mean,
An outlet right there.
it's, that indicates, if you look at everything else in terms of it,
No, it's okay.
already, those two areas. These two areas are very similar. And, but in your market, it's like the west is and east not, so whether it's.
Upper is yes, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't have even guessed that, because you
Right.
can go out this. You know, that area where it's like, maybe it's. I don't know. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, I'd just be curious to know. You know, you look at your, okay, this area.
I didn't look why it is low.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks. I just said, okay, so, first of all, I wanted to make sure that people get it done.
Yeah.
precious.
Everybody has to have the same number of minutes.
When she comes down, not right now.
Yeah.
Oh, you are.
I mean, how high is that?
Oh, there you go.
8 minutes. That's what they were told. So. Right there.
Good money.
Kristen, I think it was four.
No, no.
That's not. They changed it to
Kristen. This is great, but she's-
No.
That's a interstate.
That was a. A woman.
When Dan goes. And then she wanted to hold the data, she wasn't gonna get it. She said, "And she didn't have to."
Anything.
And then it got to be a hearing. Almost, almost.
That you
it almost
agree.
went to-
Wow. That was common with it. There was certainly another. The state.
And the instrument you don't have running in there.
Yeah.
I don't know what she said.
Kristen and her, and the other, there was a whole group of them. Or four of them.
4 girls, wow. And they were graduates then?
Well, all grad students.
Then they took up on state.
Yeah, okay, I'll go back and forth.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're the last session between everyone and beer, I understand, so I'm very dedicated to keeping us on track time-wise. I'm gonna start talking about the veg and soils theme, and then Dan's gonna help me in a little bit. So we've heard a lot of talks today about the urban environment in Baltimore, and a lot of talks have talked about some of the negative qualities of the environment, right? We have poor air quality, we have extreme heat, flooding is a problem, we know polluted soils are a problem, and there can be poor water quality. And a lot of the solutions are like, well, we'll just green it, right? Like, let's put a plant there and suddenly things are gonna be better. And we, the group of Veg and Soils, are really gonna try and dive into this a little bit more and understand what are these plants actually doing, and reminding ourselves that they are living organisms, right? Just like us.
Megan, can you share screen?
Oh, share screen. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so our focal questions for this summer are, do trees function differently depending on surrounding environmental conditions? And does type of urban environment affect plant functional types differently? So we're gonna put a big sampling campaign out this summer to try and address these questions. Trees are generally categorized into different plant functional types. Why? Because humans love to put things in categories, and we can see some big visual differences. Like, you can imagine a big, broad, deciduous leaf and compare that with a pine tree, right? And that has like a needle leaf. And so we have these different categories. We think that they lead to different functionings, and we want to understand how this plays out across environments. Why focus on plants and soils? Well, I would argue without terrestrial plants, there'd be no life on this planet, or most of the life that we associate with. So I don't think we can overstate the importance of plants, but I may be a little bit biased. So what do plants do? Plants generally translocate water from the soil into the atmosphere through transpiration. They take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it into plant biomass, and they also send some of this carbon below ground. They also are involved in cycling nutrients within the soil. And so the soil conditions are closely related to what the plants are doing. And the soil conditions are affected by microbial activity. So microscopic bacteria and fungi and archaea that are living in these soils are translocating different forms of nutrients that are really important to plants. So there's tight coupling there. And how much water the plant gets out of the soil is really going to be affected by bulk density, how compacted are these soils, by soil texture, and the soil water holding capacity. And these all will affect
how much photosynthesis and how much carbon is being taken in by the plants. So for water, we can think about plant stomata. So for the first time I saw plant stomata was like one of the best days. I was like, whoa, this is so cool. We can think about plant stomata, they're on leaves. I've got the answer, yeah. Okay, and so when the stomata is open, what's happening is that carbon dioxide is going inside the plant, and that's going to lead to photosynthesis. But as a consequence, water is being lost, right? And so when things get really dry and there's not enough water, what are plants are going to do? They're going to close their stomata, because if they lose their water, they lose too much water, they're going to have cavitation. It's ultimately going to lead to death. So they're going to have to close their stomata. But if they close their stomata for too long, they can also basically starve to death. And so this is a really important regulation, and it has a lot to do with soil water. Why do we care so much about nutrients? Photosynthesis is also nutrient limited, right? So if the stomata are open, they can have CO2, but we also have to then fix this carbon. And so here you have how much rubisco, the enzyme rubisco within a leaf, is closely correlated, tightly correlated with how much photosynthesis is occurring. Like in ecology, an R square of 0.9 is like a dreamy dream, right? But what affects how much rubisco is actually in a leaf is the nitrogen content. And so here, having nitrogen-rich soils means that there's going to be more rubisco, means you can have more photosynthesis. And so this is why we really care very strongly about the linkages between soil conditions and what the plants are actually doing, what the plants are doing on the land. So how do we measure some of this plant physiology? Well, we use some expensive, fun machines. So one thing we can do is we can measure plant physiology on the leaf level. And so physiology, we can just think of like, how much are they photosynthesizing, right? So in this example, this is someone holding a light core, which the current light core is like a $60,000 machine. These are pretty costly. We have a different version. So you put a leaf in a chamber, you have a known amount of carbon dioxide going into this chamber. The leaf is then taking it up. And you have a known amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the chamber. And you can look at those differences in carbon dioxide and have an estimate of how much the plant is photosynthesizing. We can then scale this, and then we can take this information and we can create things called ACI curves. And this is going to be a lot of what we're doing this summer. And so an ACI curve is how much carbon dioxide is inside the leaf and how much photosynthesis on the y-axis, A is a symbol for photosynthesis, is occurring. And there's a point where there's basically a linear relationship between how much carbon dioxide there is and how much the plant is photosynthesizing. And eventually that levels off, right? No matter how much more carbon dioxide you give the leaf, they're unable to photosynthesize more due to electron transport limitations. So we're going to be making a lot of these measurements, and a lot of these measurements are put into the types of Earth system models that Deanna's going to be talking about. We can also make these measurements about plant physiology on the ecosystem level. And these are using things called eddy flux towers. And what they're doing is trying to understand how much carbon dioxide is going into an ecosystem and how much carbon dioxide is coming out of an ecosystem. So while I showed you what you can do on an individual leaf, now I'm scaling up to the entire canopy, to all the plants together. And this is a picture from Ben A, who just recently put a flux tower over turf grass. Turf grass has a canopy. We don't maybe think of it, but grasses, have a canopy layer. And you can see here is time of day. And so at night, when there's no sun, the plants are respiring. They're emitting CO2. And then when the sun is out, they are taking in CO2. And then they start emitting again. And I'm basically out of time. Should have practiced. Okay, so what do we design? What are we doing this summer? I can talk more about this later, but we're going to be measuring a suite of trees across Baltimore, about 190. We're going to be measuring a suite of tree traits and a suite of soil traits. And we're going to try and link the differences between them to really understand functioning across the landscape. We're going to do this work for street trees, for park and yard trees, and for urban forest trees. So 3 really important land use types across the landscape. And here's just a map of some of the sampling locations of where we think we'll be making these measurements.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Rashuda from Oak Ridge National Lab. So I'm working on the modeling side of vegetation and soils. And so we're working with the Department of Energy's Earth System Model, which is the Energy Exascale Model, or E3SM. Its land component is ELM. And so we inherited an urban canopy model that was part of the community Earth System Model from that. The big problem there is that we don't have vegetation in it. So we've been working on making some modifications to that model to try to be able to confront it with some of these great data sets that we're going to be getting.
over the next couple of years. And so we've made some modifications where we're kind of pulling out the pervious fraction from the urban model and actually putting vegetation on that, running that forwards, making some assumptions about how much pervious fraction there is given the density class that we're in. We're bringing in 1 kilometer or higher resolution atmospheric forcing information and land surface data, which is, at least in our system modeling community, kind of a big deal, because these models are typically run at much lower resolutions, thinking like 25 or 50 kilometers. And so to be able to run at these scales is a big advance. But since we can't really run the coupled or system model at this resolution yet, I think one of our sort of near-term goals is to bring in some of this information under this ELM modeling framework, develop urban plant functional types, parameterize them with information from these leaf measurements, from these soil measurements, get that kind of biogeochemistry running in ELM, and then import that into the coupled WRF NOAA-MP framework. We'll be able to do some coupled land atmosphere simulations, and ultimately kind of looking further out into the future, we do want to eventually run E3SM at these kind of kilometer scale resolutions. And so then we'll be ready with a land surface model, ELM, that can represent these types of vegetation. So we've done just some very preliminary simulations with ELM, Broadway East, Howard Park, and Biesman Run. So 3 different kind of density classes there. So we can see the difference that it makes in GPP, or gross primary productivity, from Broadway East, which is the densest urban class, up through Biesman Run, which is just sort of non-urban classified system. So GPP varies quite a bit. And also on the right here, latent heat flux, where we see sort of the highest values in the areas with the highest photosynthesis and the lowest values in the areas with the least. And so that sort of energy balance, that carbon balance, is going to vary greatly at different areas in the city. And then I also wanted to point out other models are being run as well. So this is the VPRM model, which is run by Jason Horn. And this gives the capability to look at really high resolution, at least compared to some of the system models. This can run at 10 meters. And so what we're seeing here is a plot from a simulation from August 2021 using the WRF atmospheric outputs. And so the land cover information can come from Sentinel-2, very high resolution, and then land cover representation actually at 1 meter. And so we can see the heterogeneity and net ecosystem exchange. And so this is Clifton Park, so very high rates of uptake, especially over the turf grass, and then lower rates of uptake, obviously, over some areas with more houses and an impervious surface. So that was just a quick overview of the modeling. So if you want to learn more, we're friendly, so come talk to us. And
So anyone who veggies folks, quickly raise your hands. Come to regular meetings. Okay, look around. We all want to talk to everyone. We're very friendly. Come find us.
And I'll let you go ahead and facilitate.
Yeah,
talks.
and we'll just go straight to covering talks. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was all really cool. And I'm a sociologist and not going to be talking about any of that. So sorry. Right. So today, instead, I'm going to be talking about networks and environmental stewardship, specifically within Baltimore. Also, my name is Selena Libas, and I'm a postdoc currently at UMBC, but working with the U.S. Forest Service. Great. So the data that I'm looking at, though you can't really see it with the bar, is the Stewardship Mapping Assessment Project. Going. Oh, awesome. That's so much better. Great. So StewMap for short, and it's a survey-based methodology. So
basically within a specific city, organizations are surveyed to get information on characteristics of the organizations themselves, their like spatial location data, so where they're located, and then also who they're connected to, so other organizations they work with. And that gets us lovely network data that we haven't been able to analyze as much up until now. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about. Okay. So in terms of defining stewardship, we are looking at groups that manage, conserve, monitor, transform, advocate, and educate, all related to the environment in some way. So it's a pretty broad definition. And while StuMap has been done in more than 15 different cities over multiple countries, today I'm just looking at the Baltimore data, but I'd be happy to talk about some comparative work and other cities as well. Okay, so the data that I'm looking at today is the 2019 Baltimore StuMap. And I want to point out that what's updated, if you have seen this data before, is that we actually have cleaned alter data. And what I mean by alters are organizations that were not surveyed themselves, but that were mentioned as organizations by other ones who did respond to the survey. And so by actually searching through a lot of Google searches, we were able to get data for nearly all of our organizations on the year they were founded, the type of organization they are, the main focus of the organization with regards to their environmental work, and their location, which in this case is being measured by zip code. Okay, so just a little bit of like an overview of who these groups are. The vast majority of them are 501c, mostly threes. Oh, okay, my screen went away. It's fine. So most of them are 501c, 3s and 4s, and like a 7.
It's magic. You just touch it.
Cool. Thank you. And then we also have some community groups and organizations, and some religious congregation and nonprofit groups that don't have 501c status. That's our biggest group. And then we have about, I think it was, yeah, but like another third divided into our different public sectors. And then we have a third actually, this is new information for anyone who's seen this before. We actually have about a third of our group that are for-profit businesses. And they work on a variety of issues. So they look environment, just broad environmental issues is the second biggest category. But actually the largest category for these groups is really focusing on community improvement. And there's a lot here, but I'd be happy to talk about it more later. When they were founded, there's a lot of historical groups in Baltimore, so that's really cool. And aside from that, we can see that generally, as time goes on, more and more groups are being founded. And then networks, yay. So this is the StuMap network actually visualized. And here you can see that degree, meaning the number of ties an organization has, is represented by the size of the circle. And the color represents that those sectors that I talked about before, so where they work. And one thing I just wanted to point out from this map is that while there are, as I mentioned, a lot of for-profit groups, we can see that a lot of those for-profit groups are not these main central nodes that are bridging organizations. Most of them are going to be on the outskirts here that are being connected through a lot of nonprofits and public organizations. Okay, so the question that I'm actually asking of this data for this specific project is what drives collaboration? And in order to get at that, I am using a method that I'd be happy to talk about more later called exponential random graph models, or ERGMs for short. And the things I think are important to know about this is that they model the probability of a tie occurring. And they're great because they can account for dependency and also actually model dependency within the network. And the current model that I'm going to be showing was chosen with the best AIC and BIC. However, I haven't actually tested all of the model terms yet. I can talk a little more about that. But gonna rush through some of these just to kind of give an overview of some like quick findings. But yeah. So these are odds. All of our coefficients are shown as odds ratios. So the edges term you can think of as an intercept. What this is saying is that our network is very sparse. The probability of a tie is not very high in this network. And part of that is due to the fact that we have a lot of alters who have not actually answered our survey. That being said, we can talk about some of the other terms. So the mutual term is huge. So if there is a tie, the probability of it being a mutual tie is 160 times more likely than it not being. So lots of reciprocity going on in this network. I also, for the, I have some nodal covariates, so like organizational traits. And I wanted to point out one that was just like kind of striking, which is for main focus, groups that are focused on stormwater are 5 times as likely to send or receive a tie. So they have a lot of collaboration going on, which means they might be good groups to look at if we want to understand a little bit more about what makes groups more likely to collaborate. Then I have some distance measures, which I need to adjust a little, but I did want to show for like contiguity. This is a measure of a binary dyadic covariate of are we in contiguous zip codes? So are our zip codes sharing a border of some kind? And if we are 2 times more likely to have a tie together. And then we have some homophily effects. So these are effects for whether or not we share a trait. And by we, I mean organizations generally in this network. I just wanted to point out that in terms of our organizational type homophily, with heterophilous ties being the reference category, our federal and state government groups actually have a lot of homophilous ties. So they work with each other a lot. And then one last one is just animal groups love each other a lot. Yeah, 12 times as likely to share a tie as opposed to other groups. Okay, so just a quick wrap up. Model selection, like I said, is still underway. However, there does appear to be strong mutuality, some cool nodal effects, and homophily effects. But I am really excited to add some triadic terms and degree terms, and I'd be happy to talk more about what those are. And we actually have 3 different types of ties that are being represented in this network that we need to separate out and model separately and see how the terms compare, or how the model terms compare for each one. Yeah, and like I said, working on some comparative work as well, and I would be happy to talk about that too. Okay, thank you to all the groups and stuff that make this possible, and Dexter Locke and Nancy Santi and Morgan Grove and Claire Welty for all of their support in this and all their work in this. Yeah. Okay, I have time for questions. Yeah.
Do you by any chance have a list of meta list of all organizations?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll send you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
What defines like a tie between organizations? What are the requirements?
Yeah. Okay. So a tie in this network, in this one specifically, it can be 3 different things. So basically, these organizations were surveyed and they were asked, who do you collaborate with, who do you share resources with, and who do you share knowledge with? And so a tie in this specific, broad network is any of those 3 things. So if I said that I share knowledge or resources or just collaborate with this other organization, then we have a tie together. And they are directional as well. So like, just because I have a tie to you doesn't mean you have a tie to me. Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious, do you have any preliminary thoughts about why stormwater organizations are so much more likely to collaborate?
So I will say and admit, I'm not from Baltimore, and this is my 3rd time here. But from what I've been told, they are stormwater is a big issue in Baltimore. So I don't know what it is that makes them so much more likely to collaborate. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a super exciting finding. Like
that is a really big topic of interest in Baltimore, and trash, interestingly, was almost like the second
Probably.
one up
I don't
there,
know how to
right?
go
And
back.
trash as a focus wasn't even on the survey, but Kim Grove from DPW made us add it. So it's just fascinating to me that like a Baltimore specific option rose to really high up in Baltimore. And so I think DPW is gonna be
Trash is something.
interested to know that stormwater and trash are really high up there.
Yeah. Dexter.
My theory is it's really hard to get green stormwater infrastructure implemented. And you have to work together to get it done. And so how did you get it in your neighborhood? We want to learn from you. And so I think that might be an explanation.
And just like Megan said, for like the veg team in general, we want to talk. For the STUMAC team, we're also really like open to collaboration and using this data to answer other folks' questions, so.
And using the methods. I do networks of all kinds.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lena.
Great, now we have Ian.
We didn't really plan that segue, but this is a great segue because it's all about stormwater to some degree, indirect through soils. My name is Ian Esalonis. I work with the USDA Forest Service. I'm a soil scientist. This work is done through a collaboration with Kathy Slavics of Hopkins, Stu Schwartz down at UMBC, Philip and Lee G, who were Hopkins undergrad and grad students, and then Sam and Justin for their help.
That's presentation. Slideshow.
Slideshow, okay. Gotcha. Good. Good. So I'm going to talk about soil water flow and some of the measurements that we made. So we looked at infiltration, right? How water moves through soil, both in dry soils and wet soils. I'll explain a little bit more about that. Compaction related to bulk density and this little instrument that measures compaction, soil organic matter, and then we took 1 meter soil cores to get a better idea of what we're looking at. And all that data hopefully will allow us the ability to answer questions about land cover and urban soil function, specifically as it relates to water movement. And we hope that this data can be used to various BSEC theme groups like climate, hydrology, vegetation, and community interests, especially related to flooding. So the broad overall objective was this idea of quantifying the effect of urbanization on rainfall and runoff processes. And here is a cartoon of the natural environment with about 10% of runoff when it rains. And in the urban environment, you have about 55% runoff. And I would suggest that there's lots of variation around that mean. And the reason being is because there's lots of variation in urban soils. And so really to get a good hold on what's going on out there, we have to go out and actually directly sample these soils. To continue with the objective, so we looked at saturated and unsaturated flow. And this is the cartoon looking at hydraulic conductivity, which is the rate at which water moves through the soil. And in pure water, it's quite fast. When you have soil, then it slows down. The rate is much slower. And when you have an unsaturated soil, right, that the gravitational water is replaced by air, then that water moves much more slowly along the soil particles. And basically what these two things, they give a comprehensive view of how water moves through soils. But saturated flow explains sort of the rapid water movement through soils and surface runoff, where unsaturated flow gives us an idea of moisture and how moisture is related to soil-plant interactions. And it's also related to the fate of contaminants. Now, they both play a role, but generally speaking, one plays a greater role than the other. So what we did is we looked at 3 different land cover types, land uses. We looked at 5 forested sites, 5 parks, and 12 vacant lots throughout Baltimore City. Within the vacant lots, we established 2 plots. And within the forest and parks, we established 3, and that was simply because of size. We collected soil density at 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 centimeters. We did the 1 meter core. We used a penetrometer to look at compaction. And then for saturated flow, we use an automated Saturo. We just recently got that instrument and tried it out last summer when we collected all the data, and a mini disc, which looks at unsaturated. So I like these photos because it gives you an idea of what it looked like in the field. So we would lay out flags, we would take our penetrometer readings, right? We would take readings of how compacted the soil is. This is the Saturo that Lychee is running. It's automated. Philip was doing a single ring. Here we have the 1 meter ESP core. And then we have the mini disc, which measures unsaturated flow. So to get into the data, this is bulk density, right? A measure of density. Water is about 1. A forest soil tends to be about 1. And then we looked at organic matter. In the 0 to 5 at the surface, compared to the deeper depths, we have increase in bulk density in forest. We have increase in park and increase in vacant. So that is exactly what we would expect. As you go further down into the soil profile, it becomes denser. And for organic matter, same thing. You would expect a decrease in soil organic matter. What we did not expect was this huge amount of organic matter in the vacant lots and the low bulk density. So when we first started this project, we did not make that assumption. We actually expected this to be much higher in bulk density, much lower in soil organic matter. So this is a result related to the Saturo, which is saturated flow, right? Here's our machine. And we have values of, I don't know, 35 centimeters per hour, looking at forest, park, and vacant. And as I was putting this presentation together, I'm like, this kind of data reminds me of something. It reminded me of like the nightmare I had of the possibility of non-significant results when I was doing my PhD dissertation. I'm like, oh, all the things. So we're going to look more into this data to figure out what's going on. For the mini disc, we do have some significant results, right? So vacant and forest are significantly different. These are values that Bill Schuster found in vacant lots up in Cleveland, and these are values somewhat similar to what we found in Baltimore with Tawana Phillips and Mitch Pablo's up and then down at College Park. There is a nice relationship somewhat, R² 0.14 of bulk density, higher bulk density, the lower the infiltration rate related to unsaturated flow, and organic matter. And this is something that we would expect to see. Last slide. So this was the penetrometer. I looked, so we have the forest here, still meadow. This is just an example of what we collected, the 3 plots. And then the vacant lot, there were only 2, right? So we had a yard plot, and then we had the house footprints. And we would like to relate this data to what we're finding in terms of infiltration. This is a value down to 30 centimeters and 100 centimeters. And what we did is we pushed it down until we got to a PSI of 300, which is sort of limiting for roots. And so you can see that there is less variability in the forest and more in the vacant lot. I mean, this went down to 1 meter before we decided to pull it up. So depending where we took our sample, where we took our infiltration, you can see that there's a great amount of variance within a certain plot. And so summary, both saturated and unsaturated flow are complementary in describing water flow dynamics. Surprisingly, vacant lots had the highest rate for unsaturated flow. And ongoing, what we hope to do is possibly do some more vacant lot data this summer. We collected single ring, so we want to compare that to the Saturo and make sure that we got good values and play around with that data. Within the forest, we did single ring, Saturo, and modified Philip time. So that's just a comparison between methods. And then we want to analyze texture down to a meter, get a better idea of what's going on in these vacant forest areas so that we can help define models. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I have very little background knowledge on this, but for the insignificant or non-significant findings, like, could that possibly just be the finding, like that there isn't?
It could very much well be, very much. So across the city, you know, if we were to extrapolate that land cover, land use really does not make much of a difference, and there might be another drive. Yes, but it's hard to publish.
I know.
Next.
Physical characteristics of the forest be making it hard to measure, like they're catching more of the rain than the leaves, there's all those roots that you're not gonna get through.
So we just poured water onto the soil directly.
There's no rain.
Some of those areas like Springfield Woods, they're hydrophobic because that greenbrier, you know, it breaks down, and so each forest is very unique. Just like, you know, it's like, you know, going out to these forest patches, there's not a typology of, okay, this is this type of forest patch. So yeah, there was a fair amount of variability associated with them.
Yeah, you've got a 6 meter by 6 meter design. It's like lots of the residential yard. Are there any trends, or was it purely random? Any trends as you approach the house foundation or the curb?
So we are analyzing that data. I wanted to put that up there just so that everyone knew that we had the data. And so we're in the process of figuring it out. But it would be interesting if the house footprint is, you know, in terms of the coefficient of variation, much higher than what you would, you know, in the resident lawn that was undisturbed as the vacant lot was being established.
Okay, I'm going to talk about changes in the terrestrial aquatic interface and effects that it has on greenhouse gas fluxes. And so this is soil and vegetation talk, but this is a topic that really cuts across the soil and vegetation group, the water quality group, and the greenhouse gas effect group. So one of the most well-established effects of urbanization is degradation of the terrestrial aquatic interface. And you can see this is a picture of a natural stream channel, the natural terrestrial aquatic interface. And there's this whole web of connectivity in that interface. So you can see there's a shallow water table, and so the vegetation has their feet in the water table, and the stream is frequently flooding and adding water and sediment to the riparian zone. And the vegetation is feeding the stream. And so there's this web of connectivity, which makes the terrestrial aquatic interface of great interest in the structure and function of urban ecosystems, very important for water quality maintenance. But when we put impervious surface into watersheds, it changes the way water moves across the landscape, and water comes off the landscape into the stream with great energy, and it degrades the stream channel and it incisors the stream channel. It lowers the water table, and you get all that connectivity is degraded. So you don't have the groundwater surface interaction, you don't have the flooding, you don't have the organic matter input into the stream. And so this degradation of connectivity has been well established in urban ecology back to the 60s, and the fundamental work was done here at Johns Hopkins. A guy, Reds Wollman, well, put your hands over our hearts, Reds Wollman. They characterized this urban stream syndrome back in the 60s. And so we've studied this a lot over the years in Baltimore. This degradation of the stream channels and the stormwater effects has created tremendous interest in mitigation, and there's a national stormwater program. And the big response to that is to create detention basins. So here you can see suburban development, and these developments are designed to capture that water and detain it in this structure to dissipate that energy before it goes in the stream. And this has been ongoing since the 50s and the 60s. People had making detention basins. And it really is, it's creating a new terrestrial aquatic interface. And so if the urban stream syndrome kind of eliminates the original terrestrial aquatic interface, are we creating a new terrestrial aquatic interface in these landscapes? So this is a suburban landscape. Here's a stream. with pretty heavily degraded stream and riparian zone. And can you find the detention basins in this landscape? So here's the one I just showed you before. But if you look at it, they're all over the place. And so when you think about it, what we have done is we have dissipated the terrestrial aquatic interface. We've taken it from the stream, the traditional stream riparian interface, and then dissipated it all over the landscape. Well, the question is, what are the functional effects of that? It's been quite effective for dissipating stormwater runoff and improving water quality. But some of our questions are what effects might this have on greenhouse gas emissions? Are we creating little hotspots for greenhouse gas emissions in the landscape that we would need to consider against their water quality benefits, against their stormwater control benefits? And this is something we should think about. So we've been measuring greenhouse gas emissions here in Baltimore since 1998. And so we've got this monthly sampling of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane at a bunch of different sites, urban and rural forests. We've been sampling lawns. We've been sampling natural riparian zones. We've been sampling some detention basin sites. And some of our traditional questions have been, well, how does land use affect greenhouse gas fluxes? Forest versus grass versus riparian zone. How does landscape position, which is the upland forest and the riparian zones? And we've been doing that for a long time. The new question that we've been going after for BSEC is this question of, does the green stormwater infrastructure create hotspots of greenhouse gas fluxes, in particular methane and nitrous oxide? And then further, how important are these? So if they are hotspots, what are we going to do about it, as we like to say? What are you going to do about it? Okay, so here's some of our old data that we published. Well, this is updated data, but we've been measuring methane uptake. And soils take methane up out of the atmosphere. It's an important term in regional and global budgets, methane budgets. They pull methane out of the atmosphere. And our rural forests have very strong methane uptake, similar to other forests that have been studied. They take methane up. Urban forests, there's a real strong urban effect. The urban atmosphere is reducing the ability of those forests to take up methane. And then grass sites have no capacity to take up methane. It's completely eliminated. We also had a very strong temporal pattern where we had this really marked decline in uptake that ended in about 2015 or so. And that seems to have turned around in the last 10 years or so, which is a little bit of a mystery. But there's a strong land use effect or land cover effect, and there's a temporal effect for methane. Nitrous oxide, we also see this temporal effect. Again, we're looking at rural forests, urban forests, and grass. It declined over the first 10 years or so. The record seems to be coming back up. The differences between the forests, the rural forests, and the urban forests and the grass are not as strong as they are for methane, and not as strong as we expected. But there are some differences. So this is our nitrous oxide, our mean nitrous oxide flux measurements in milligrams per centimeter squared. So I've got urban forests and rural forests. These urban forests, the urban forests, they have a greenhouse gas problem. They take up less methane and they produce more nitrous oxide. I have riparian zones. I have urban riparian zones and I have rural riparian zones. And the urban riparian zones, they produce more nitrous oxide than the rural riparian zones. And then the real question of these detention basins, these are stormwater detention basins, they do not appear to be gigantic hotspots for nitrous oxide emission in the landscape. How about methane? So now here's our methane fluxes. Again, mean methane fluxes, and here's the urban and rural forest that I showed you before, and the lawns that I showed you before. You can see that there's big significant differences in uptake, but they're small compared to these hotspots of flux. So my riparians, these are swamps. They're wet, anaerobic environments, and both natural riparian zones, urban and rural, and then one of the detention basins seem to be hotspots for methane flux. And again, just to review, these fluxes are very small, like -1 is the uptake, and then these hotspots are like 50 or 60. So they're big numbers. Okay, so does this matter? So we've been chasing the forest, urban, rural, and grass for a while. We published in 2019. We said if we assume 10% of Maryland is covered by grass, and we can calculate how much methane uptake is lost, that's about 37,000 tons of carbon. It's equivalent to the emissions associated with about 7,000 people, 15,000 cows, 33,000 cars. Is that a lot? I don't know. There's a lot of cars in the state of Maryland. There's a lot of cows in the state of Maryland. So it's a number. It's a number. if we, now, the new calculations we're making is, if I assume that 1% of Maryland is riparian zone or green infrastructure, and they have these hotspots, it's about the same. It's about 44,000 tons of carbon, 8,000 people, 18,000 cattle, 40,000 cars. And again, so these are numbers. The question is, what do we do with these numbers? And so natural greenhouse gases are important. They're very responsive to land use change. They're responsive, they change over time. They're very dynamic. Some actionable items, green stormwater infrastructure. There's a lot of interest. We want green stormwater infrastructure. It's very effective for controlling stormwater and for improving water quality. Should we be worried about the fact that they have some trace gas fluxes? Maybe yes, maybe no. Same with the land use change to lawns. Lawns also, we have both a nitrous oxide effect and we have a methane effect. It's a small, but it's a measurable effect. Lawns, we're concerned about the nitrogen performance of lawns, but lawns, people like their lawns. And so the question is, what are we supposed to do with these numbers? That's why I'm glad we have an integrated urban field laboratory, right? Because this is the kind of question that we've got to kind of put it together at the end and say, how important are these greenhouse gas fluxes? Do we compare about them compared to their water quality value or their aesthetic value or their values for physical and mental health? And we can figure that out. Thank you.
So for the nitrous oxide flux, is there a way to normalize it by using available nitrogen or some source of soil nitrogen?
Yes, so we think that all these greenhouse gas dynamics are controlled by nitrogen availability. But coming up with the proper measure of nitrogen availability has been tough. So, but we did with the methane, there was a super strong relationship between nitrification rates in the soil and the methane uptake rates. And I think it's going to be the same for the nitrous oxide, which we look at. But it's definitely the inorganic pools turn over too quick, so we think it's nitrification.
Thank you. It was a fantastic presentation. I'm wondering, I mean, for me, and again, we see what we want to see, right? We try to limit that, but you're making a case for why green spaces in urban areas should be farms as opposed to landscapes.
Why?
Well, when you are growing food, you have to be very careful with the quality of the soil.
Right.
And you're presenting that the gardens or the lawns are not doing that.
Right. So now, there's a big difference between lawns and agriculture. And it's actually been one of our more contentious results over time, is we compare agricultural watersheds with suburban watersheds. And the water quality in the suburban watersheds tends to be much better than in the agricultural watersheds. Agricultural watersheds, especially in terms of nutrients, are very rich in nutrients. And so a lot of times people look at our results and say, yeah, if we could just get rid of all those damn farms and replace them with subdivisions, we would solve our water quality problems in the Chesapeake Bay, which is a very unsatisfactory answer, because we know that agriculture provides lots of services that we want. So, but that's another really good example of the kind of question that we can sort through by looking at both the social dimensions, like sustainability. You have an economic analysis, you have an environmental analysis, you have an equity analysis. We can do that.
Functional and functional.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Max Sadiq, and I am a PhD candidate in landscape architecture at Penn State. My work mostly aligns with the community engagement team, but most recently I have started working with the soil and vegetation team as well. So today I'm going to present the work that we have very recently initiated with the soil and vegetation group. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, the title of the study that we are trying to examine is examining the socio-psychological predictors of tree adoption behavior. And we are using the theory of plant behavior, which I will explain later. And we are focusing on the Baltimore Justice for the communities.
So why is this important? As we know, urban forests and street trees provide essential ecosystem services and play a very important role in mitigating climate change. However, the distribution of urban forests is uneven across US cities, and also underserved neighborhoods often experience insufficient coverage. And also, despite the endeavors that municipalities and also nonprofit tree planting programs, there is still low participation from the community members and residents for in terms of engagement in tree adoption programs. So the overall goal for the study would be to determine the social psychological factors that influence residents' tree adoption behavior. And also for that, we will be using the theory of planned behavior framework, which is basically a theoretical framework that explains that an individual's intentional behavior towards adopting something is influenced by 3 factors. That includes attitude toward that behavior, there's the subjective norm, and also the perceived behavioral control. By attitude, we mean that individual's positive and also negative perception of performing that behavior. And the subjective norm is the social pressure that the individual feels from the people around them, like their neighbors, their family, their co-workers, and also the perceived behavioral control is the perception of whether or not they are able to perform that behavior. And then intention is their readiness to perform that behavior, and behavior obviously is the performance of that behavior in the past. So far, we have started the literature review. The team suggested some great literature, and also we try to look at the social psychological determinants of tree adoption behavior, and also whether or not there has been any other studies in urban forestry that adopt this particular framework, theoretical framework, and also what other urban tree studies have been conducted in Baltimore specifically. And also we reviewed the existing Baltimore City surveys to make sure there isn't any redundancy and there isn't where the overlap is. So this is one of the surveys that was shared either by Megan, Nancy, or Dexter, that we realized there was some overlap in terms of the questions that they covered for activities, which is the behavior construct in our framework, but that mostly focuses on like invasive tree removal, rain barrel installation, so GSI, so it doesn't specifically focus on urban trees. And then the other surveys mostly look at the attitude, which is about, again, individuals' concerns or the perceived benefits of trees. Again, this survey covers some of these questions related to attitude, and this one doesn't have any overlap. So through the literature review and also review of the surveys, we identified the gaps in the literature, which include there is a limited overall application of the theory of planned behavior to tree adoption behavior. There are a few studies which are not within the US context. And also these studies mostly focus on attitude and do not focus on the subjective norm and perceived behavioral control. And also there is a limited understanding of the intention behavior gap, which is why individuals intend to adopt a tree, but fail to follow up with the actual behavior. And also we realized that the tree adoption behavior is very contextually framed. So depending on the cultural, social, environmental context, the behavior varies. So with this study being limited to Baltimore justice for the community, I think we can also determine what contextual factors influence their tree adoption behavior. And also there is lack of research on the impact of policy incentives on individuals' behavior. So that is also a factor we decided to consider. So with that, we extend that framework that we identified at the beginning, and we are going to incorporate the policy incentives into the model. And also we are going to look at both homeowners and renters to look at whether or not there is a difference. So actually to identify the predictive role of policy incentives in changing intentions to behavior, and also to compare the predictive power of the TPV model between adoption behavior in renters and homeowners. So we are going to use a social survey, which will be a combination of both paper-based and online. We are aiming for at least 500 complete responses. And we have also already started some conversations with Kalia, our community engagement coordinator, and also the other stakeholders who can help us with distribution of the survey. So far, we have submitted the IRB. We have a draft of the survey. We are going to revise it within the next couple of months, maybe during June and July. So we have the survey ready to be launched in August. And yeah. The community engagement work that I have been doing, I'm not going to cover because I think Tanya and Derek will cover tomorrow, but we have been doing some literature review work in terms of the motivations, impacts, and ethical considerations for community engagement. I will be in Portland late in June to present the work in EDRA. We have also submitted an abstract to NAAEE, which is the North American Association of Environmental Education, which mostly focuses on urban youth empowerment and education. We have also presented part of this work to ARCC, which is the architecture conference, which was in Denmark early June, I think, or late May. So yeah, I think that's it.
Yes, so I saw tree planting and tree maintenance as the behaviors, right? For
Right.
tree planting, I'm wondering, will you be asking where they planted the tree? Because for renters, that's just a really interesting question in itself. Like, is it on that property where they live, or like down the street, or?
I think what we've discussed so far is for the renters, it would be in the street they are living in, and for homeowners, it would be their backyard or front yard. So that would be the difference. Yeah.
For the tree maintenance portion, I know that for the first couple of years of the new tree, the water is super important. Are these surveys expected the renters to provide that water and then the economic barrier? How is that in the survey?
I think that is something that started us to think about the policy incentives and whether or not there's going to be any incentives provided for something like what you're mentioning for like watering the trees. But that's a great question. I think we have to consider that how we can incorporate all of those into our survey questions. Yeah.
In terms of rent versus homeowners is great, but I'm also curious about the other demographic breakdowns, like generationally. I know that younger generations are super environmentally conscious, whether they're renter or not, you might see some sort of great correlation between those who would be more engaged to do something like that. So I'm curious if you monitoring the other.
Yeah.
You might be taking it up just with the nature of the survey, but is it something that you're looking at?
Yeah, so for this one, like the context specific factors, I think those kind of demographic questions would be within this as well. But I know that I have to modify this framework to incorporate the demographic questions, which covers the context factor as well. That will also go, that would be kind of a control variable. At the end, we will measure whether those control variables have an impact on the overall behavior or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, especially with the social norm, we might see a racial breakdown as well.
Right.
I know for like in Detroit, some of the lower income neighborhoods actually really resist new trees being put into their urban neighborhoods because of a real negative connotation. Because in the 70s, they put in 4 species that really damaged their house, and then a lot of people lost their livelihoods and homes. So I'm curious to see what Baltimore's overall cultural norm or social norm, but then what that would look like further down. So the demographics would be.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I think since this is still in the proposal stage and we have not launched our survey yet, these suggestions are great. So if anyone else has any suggestions, please feel free to share them with us. So we can consider it in our survey.
So for renter, I'm getting into this idea of renters. I mean, basically, right, it's a landlord that makes the decision. So if you have a landlord that owns 20 rentals, that landlord is going to affect how trees are planted on this property. Yeah. So how are you gonna separate sort of like the mom and pop, landlords opposed to these larger landlords and their effect on the renters?
I haven't thought about that, but yeah, Dexter, maybe we should discuss this later. See how we can consider this. Yeah, that's a great point.
You might need to tie it to one address.
Yeah.
That's what we do for the landowner survey, it's like, they're not answering for their 20 properties, they're
just one.
answering for that one.
Okay.
Probably, but yeah, certainly something to consider.
Right. Thank you.
And last but
Yeah, my goodness, this is the worst possible position you can be at, being the last and being in between the food, in between the beer or whatever, but I'll try to be quick here. So I'm Kathy Slavets, I'm the faculty here at Johns Hopkins University. You just heard my twin brother here, over there, Ian Yasunonis. I'll tell you why I think he's my twin brother. Heelin and Jihoon are undergraduates who used to be or current undergraduates who actually contributed a lot to the data that I'm showing, but we have a lot of people to thank for helping in the field, lab, landing equipment, and things like that. Okay, this is, what am I supposed to press here?
Down arrow.
Oh, down arrow, not the space arrow. I'm pressing the down arrow and nothing is happening. Try the mouse, okay. And I didn't do anything. Oh, here we go. So this is why I think he's my twin brother, because you already saw something similar. This is a little bit different because it focuses on mostly physical chemical properties. Ian talked about function, added the moisture temperature. And again, you can figure out probably which one of those are connected to which other theme, hopefully as an input parameter to their models or something that, for instance, just data that say the community is very much interested in. Ultimately, we're doing this also, of course, because we want to understand this extremely complex urban landscape, soil landscape, which is one of the biggest challenges of urban research, I would think. So I put this together with my co-author down here for soil biodiversity sort of research framework, but I think it works very well in this case, of course, or any kind of urban research, because it's showing the very close tie between social and physical systems, the various connections and feedback mechanisms, direct and indirect mechanisms, specifically for soil, and how this ends up essentially providing certain services or these services. We don't usually talk about these services, but there are such things and functions. And then all this is embedded in a spatial temporal context, understanding that things change at different time scale and things also change at different spatial scale. And we heard a lot about spatial and temporal resolution today and the need to know what's optimal for what questions. So for this talk, forget about the time. Other than one thing, which is one of the most important things in urban soil research, you need to know the site history in order to understand the data that you are collecting. And history is, of course, is time and many different scales. But what I would like to do is just to illustrate some of the data that we collected at different spatial scale, and I will highlight these things. So this is increasing, going from a little patch over to city or even larger scales, starting with this project that actually started before BSEC was even funded. And this is our vacant lot study in two neighborhoods, 100 vacant lots, which were generally of the same age. And so we conducted this study to look at soil quality, if you will, measured soil chemistry, nutrients, pH, all kinds of stuff on surface soil. So these are just surface soil data. And the way we did it, we took 3 relatively thick soil cores from the front, middle, and the back, of a vacant lot. We composited, we mixed that, and then analyzed that. And so we got a lot of data I'm not going to show you. And the data are varied, of course. They show certain distribution, frequency distribution, the means or medians or whatever you want to look at, sometimes very high. So Ian has also talked about high organic matter content, very high pH, extremely high calcium. And we even found some differences by what we call construct, which is the way the protocol, the different protocols the companies use to demolish and establish the vacant lots for certain elements or certain parameters. But of course, eventually you want to map these things. So this is a map in East Baltimore for carbon. Larger circles means more carbon. And again, just want to point out, or you can call it soil organic matter if you will. These are very large, high organic matter soils. And so we have a lot of those in these different places. But then again, the community, of course, interested in something else, mostly heavy metal and specifically lead concentration. So this is a lead concentration map, in which case the binning is different because what we used is a Canadian system of essentially decided what we consider level 1, 2, and 3 screening levels. So 3 being really bad, and then green being really good. And so you can see we have a few bad ones, but we have most of them are somewhere in between, which is not necessarily a good thing. But what it taught us was that, so essentially what came out of this is that there's a huge variability. Well, big surprise. And so you can see that even if you don't analyze anything, just look at these photos. Each of these is one vacant lot from the front, middle, and the back. So you can see sometimes the differences are really huge. So what this motivated us is that to say, well, maybe by mixing these things together, we are actually losing some information about final scale variability. So on a subset of these plots, we did a fine scale sampling. So this is a typical lot, a row home. All of these figures I'm going to show you are looking like this. This is the street, the back alley, and we conducted in 11 or 12 of those a fine scale. So these are 5 meter by 5 meter grids. And we took a soil core on each of those grids and analyzed them individually. And so not just in order to establish the screening levels, being these values are really bad and these values are really good, we also looked at, okay, so what's a typical, park lawn grass? So we did the same thing in 2 of these parks, the same size, roughly the same size as a row home vacant lot. So this is how they look like. They're good, they're yellow. And then this is how some of these vacant lots look like. So clearly there are huge heterogeneities, which we might have missed with our sampling design, or we sort of diluted them because we mixed up the soil. So this is showing all of these lots. Again, each of these is a vacant lot. Just again, the blue, these dark ones are really bad, high, and the yellow is good. And so what you can see is that there is a huge variation, again, among the lots, but within the lots, there are clearly hotspots, or sometimes it's even worse than that. And down here, that's for lead. Down here, I'm showing the same thing for zinc. And that's because I would like you to notice that there are similar patterns for zinc. So there are higher concentration for lead, higher concentration for zinc. And so that's what we think is because both of them are house paint additives. Okay, so this is what we learned, but of course it doesn't help solve the climate issue. Now the soil, of course, is a 3-dimensional entity. So we are also interested in these changes with depth. And so even small changes, again, now we sliced out a few of these, even this is a 10 centimeters. So we're looking at fine changes in depth. This is a place which is central now for BSEC. This is just 2 individual cores. This is lead concentration. One has nothing. The other is full of it, and it's increasing with depth. So going back to what the other teams, maybe data can use or would like us to provide. So now we're looking at much deeper, 1 meter deep. So we talk about a lot about this 1 meter deep course. And so these are just a bunch of soil monoliths that my student Philip Soderberg put together. They are next to the food. You cannot avoid them. So please take a look and enjoy looking at these variabilities of the forest or vacant lots. You can play and try to figure out which one comes from where. But again, so we have a huge variability, and that's what we are going to focus in these upcoming months. We already had a ton of data, a ton of these scores, so which we are going to slice up and determine all those things: texture, compaction, well, compaction not so much, texture, soil organic matter, and we're going to collect some more as needed. And some of these are actually already, we have some data for, we have a poster, and these are the ones from the vacant lots, a comparison between the house footprint and where the historical front yard or backyard might have been. Okay, so take a look at this poster. In addition to that, we're also going to do other stuff. So this is something that Megan talked about. This feeds into the general soil characterization, which we said we would do for BSAC, based upon land use, land cover, and soil disturbance, which is the term we like to use. We already sampled Howard Park, and so we might do a few more sampling. We have data from roadways. We're gonna do, or I'm planning to do, in coordination with Darren's weather station, some soil moisture measurement. And then we already have some plans, as the community asked us to do additional sampling analysis on methods. So, thank you. I didn't even look at your, I don't know how, I did well, okay. Yes, huh?
You have a minute for questions.
I have a minute for questions. Okay, sorry. Let's go over that. We can ask the question. Yeah.
So I think I heard from Jan's and your talk that you're seeing a lot of variability.
Yeah.
Is there anything generalizable at all, or is it complete chaos out there?
Well, we think that yeah, it's gonna be a lot of variability, but I think I'm hoping that if we increase the sample size, because this is the problem, we can lump together in meaningful groups. I have to tell you that deep soil cores haven't been analyzed for texture or soil organic matter for a lot of other things. So I know we in other cities they do lump them together, and so we're hoping we will be by the time we are done with the analysis and we actually looked at these soil cores, we might be able to have establish some meaningful categories. I mean, certainly the highest variability is among the human, what we call, what's that, human aggregated, human transported. So the stuff that's in a vacant. For your particular interest, probably the differences between forest soils, which are still naturally showing naturally developing soil profiles instead of less.
Okay, we have time for 4 questions for veg and soils overall. Are there any questions?
So we're doing atmospheric modeling, and in our model, there is soil category parameter that we're using. For example, approximately 400 by 4 kilometer domain. What our model, my parameter tells us was like it's just half the domain of the class. And it's one soil category on the top, another soil category on the bottom. Sure. Yeah, what do you think about it? How realistic or unrealistic is it?
Well, I think if you know, both of those presentations about soil show that it's unrealistic. But then how do you get one value for, what's it, 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers? How do you get one value for the different layers that you're dealing with? I don't know how you do. I mean, you could take a mean right? And then we give you a generalizable. We don't have to. Yeah,
That's just the base, that's the default.
right, gotcha.
We gotta do something.
So then how do we
You tell us what
define
to
that?
do.
So to answer that, and also answer your question. We'll give you some numbers and then you can play with it, maybe it doesn't matter. So we don't know if in terms of your model, how much difference makes a difference, right? So we can provide some input data and then hopefully we can play with it and say, well, this doesn't matter on this scale or that scale or that or something. That's how we feel about this.
Yeah, for somebody who does a lot of the atmospheric modeling and comes from a hydro soils background, the first thing I saw was this soil categories they broke it up into. And I said, oh my God, what is this? So yeah, I think we could definitely do a better job than we're doing right now. I think anything could really help.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Jason, sorry. But yeah, I would, maybe I should put that together sometime, kind of what it looks like from the model perspective currently in BSEC. Thermal conductivity, hydraulic conductivity, these parameters that are thrown in there for these categories, broken into like 16 different categories.
And the
Maybe I'll do that.
vegetation parameters.
Huh? What'd you say, Ken?
And the vegetation parameters.
Oh yeah, and the vegetation parameters. Yeah, don't get me started. Okay, anyway, but yeah, this is all great stuff.
Get started.
Get started, yeah.
Nice way today. So urban air quality can impact vegetation and vegetation can impact air quality. I'm wondering if you guys have been thinking about that / what my group can be doing to help you think about that.
We do think about that. It's something we're interested in. It's really hard to study. And we don't necessarily have the expertise within our group, but I don't think like it's not on our docket for this summer, but I think this is a big grant for many years and it's something we'd certainly love to talk about going forward.
So yeah, if there's like instrumentation or type of measurements that you'd like to see long-term, let us know so we can think about it. Or if there's like more intensive type things that if we go to a plot that you're studying heavily, that we should do type of measurements, we should talk offline and figure out what would make sense.
Awesome. We can talk now over beer. I think we should wrap on up.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. So we've got poster and refreshments. We've also got a visitor, she's not here, but Audrey from NOAA's got a air quality backpack that she's going to bring out so we can look at, and she might even take it on the walking tour of Old Goucher. So in terms of that, I think Matthias is coming at some time before 6, and we'll just kind of self-organize around 6 o'clock.
How much does Michael?
What?
We're on the day.
Yeah, we've only done day 1. We've got King's got to do it tomorrow as well. So it's not over yet. That's a lot.
The one you said, like, the 2 lead ones that. Were those